Now let's dig into this exciting part. I'm so happy to have someone here on the stage with me finally. I was starting to get a complex. I kept sitting up here on my own, talking to screens, and it felt like I was back at home again during the Zoom era during COVID-19. So Rebecca, thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you. Nice
again, I'm Kevin Mahn. For those of you who didn't hear the earlier session I spoke on, I'm the President and Chief Investment Officer at Hennion and Walsh Asset Management, also the Chief Investment Officer of Smart Trust Unit Investment Trust, which is the sponsor of the Sustainable Impact Investing Trust Strategy. Enough about me. Now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Rebecca, I'll have you go last. And why don't we start with Aeisha? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and also who you represent, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Aeisha Mastagni, and I am a portfolio manager in the Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies unit of CalSTRS. We sit beside the investment office. CalSTRS is the California Teachers Retirement System, so we're trying to provide a safe and secure retirement for the teachers of California.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Aeisha. Senator Galvez?
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, I'm a senator at the Canadian Parliament, but as a background, I'm an engineer. I sit in the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee, but also in the National Finances one. I'm very pleased that we are having this important conversation today. I hope I will be able to talk about the bill that I tabled in the Senate, Climate Aligned Finance, short called CAFA, and looking forward to discuss with you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Amy Hepburn?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
Good
it's a
afternoon.
pleasure to be here on this panel. Sorry I can't be there in person. I agree it's a lot more fun to be having these conversations in person, but very glad to join. I am the CEO of the Investor Leadership Network. The ILN, as we call it, was formed during the 2018 G7 and represents 13 of the largest institutional investors globally across the G7. So we represent 10 trillion assets under management, invested across every region and every asset class. Our areas of focus include climate change, meaningful action in increasing diversity and investment across the industry and amongst our members, and third, sustainable infrastructure. So we're looking forward to the conversation today.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. And last but certainly not least, Rebecca Brown.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Brown. I'm from Tobacco Free Portfolios. I'm the U.S. Director. We're a 501c3 that partners with the financial sector and encourages the exclusion of tobacco from all commercial lines of business. Prior to joining Tobacco Free Portfolios, I was on the buy side for 16 years, where I headed up the sustainable investing efforts, sort of a grassroots for a value shop here in the city.
Excellent. Just anecdotally, I was on Power Lunch last Thursday, and I made the comment that I believe the Fed is going to turn less aggressive after the November and December meetings, and in all likelihood, that last 75 basis point hike marked peak hawkishness. The moderator, the anchor, Tyler Matheson, asked me what I was smoking, and I proudly said, Tyler, in all my life, I've never smoked anything. So I am true tobacco-free person.
It's
so
good to hear.
I back up your tobacco-free portfolios. But let's start with the topic of this panel. And Aeisha, I'm going to pose this question to you first, please. But what do you believe is the best and or quickest way to net zero?
So starting off with those easy ones.
Yes, it is a softball question.
So what we're trying to do at CalSTRS is really align our investment activities with a responsible transition to a global net zero economy. But we don't really believe that we can do that alone. The threat of climate change requires an integrated response from the world's governments, businesses, investors, communities. So we certainly can't do it alone. And I know that's not, I'm sort of sidestepping your question, but I don't think there's one response. I think we each have to play our part, and that's what we're trying to do with the CalSTRS portfolio and our pledge to get to net zero by 2050.
I love the answer. Senator Galvez, is there just one route to net zero, and what's the quickest way for us all collectively to get there?
Absolutely. There are several, multitude of roadmaps, and every state nation has to choose the one that is convenient to them. But as an engineer, let me tell you that for the last 20 years, we are telling engineers that we were in transition. So it is sad to say that this transition is stagnant. And what is problematic is that the longer we delay, the less orderly will be this transition, and the higher the risk of more destruction as we see it every year, the higher social and financial instability. 50 years ago, we had the luxury of time. Today, we need to transform. So what do? The best transition is the speedy one, and it tackles the low-hanging fruit, such as the electrification of public and good transport, the energy efficiency in buildings, tap in high industrial emitters, adopt renewable energy, which are in free fall prices, massive reforestation. And to do that, we need the machine, the financial sector, to come and fill up and do the role, the central role that is needed in order to activate this transformation. So my bill that was tabled March in the Senate aims to hold the financial sector accountable, but also present opportunities, because there is a lot of innovation and opportunities for job creation and ingenuity and creativity. And so we need to go beyond the disclosure of climate risk. As Rebecca probably knows, the doctor cannot just tell to the patient you have lung cancer. It has to propose a treatment, and it has to address the cause. And I congratulate you, because you said that you don't smoke. So at least that cause for you is up. So my bill activates 7 actions, including, for example, changing fiduciary duty of director of financial institutions in order to align with climate commitments that we have.
Very good points. Disclosure is a very important first step, but it's just that, a first step, and there's more work to be done. Amy, ILN's perspective on the global race to net zero.
Yeah, no, I would second both points. Aeisha, there's not one size fits all. It's just not one approach that's going to work. But I would say that the ILN is really, we just did an inventory of this, actually. We just launched a Net Zero Investor Playbook last week that's on our website, which was looking at what are our 13 members doing, as well as what is the industry doing at large in the space of transition finance, in trying to get to net zero. What are we doing? And there were 4 areas where we felt like they were sort of bucketing their activities. One was emission forecasting to interim targets, adjusting portfolio construction, looking at that, aligning portfolio construction with different transition taxonomies, looking at these taxonomies, how is that working, assessing portfolios transition capacity. So looking at those, we saw all different types of approaches, like you said, Senator Galvez. It's really getting creative. But at the end of the day, I think we're seeing a lot of customization on behalf of our members, just to sort of be in line with their mandates and their, and their fiduciary responsibilities. However, so not to navigate this question completely away from an answer, I would say that if there is one approach that I'm seeing on behalf of our members, so our 10 trillion, it would be engagement. We're seeing more often than not, investors want to engage. We do have, we do have investors that are pulling out. We do have divestment for sure as a strategy, but we do see engagement over the long term as being a preferred approach that is yielding towards real economy decarbonization.
Interesting. Rebecca, leverage, engagement, what's your view on the race to net zero?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that you can't let perfection stop you from making some sort of step forward, right? And so clearly there's challenges in sort of data consistency, reportability, but I think that the having an intentional sort of first step is really important. And as an example, a lot of financial institutions have used tobacco exclusion as a step in their net zero journey because of the environmental impact that the industry has. So you can actually make a meaningful step towards those net zero commitments without having to reinvent the wheel.
Yes.
So it's about making progress, right? And it has to happen yesterday.
Yes.
So, you know, the fastest way is just to get started immediately.
Maybe I could just follow up with a question. What do you
Sure.
see then as the biggest obstacles or hurdles to achieving net zero? Or put differently, as the topic of this question, sleeping with the enemy, who is or what is the real enemy on that front?
Yeah, I mean, look, when it comes to the biggest emitters, it's a big question, and I know the institutional allocators will, you know, probably chime in on this as well. But you know, I think there is an argument for engagement. Again, it's putting the right tools with the right issue, right? And so you can, in fact, make progress on net zero commitments by engaging, especially if you are a large institutional allocator and, you know, can potentially band together with other allocators to sort of really put forth your agenda, right? So, but in terms of, you know, exclusion, divestment, you know, when it comes to tobacco, the answer is exclusion. Okay, there's no reason, there's no engagement there on that front. But in other, you know, in other areas of the market, engagement can be an incredibly powerful tool, right?
Yes.
So when it comes to fossil fuels, I'd love to get their feedback, because I think that's a really complicated conversation. Yeah.
Aeisha, perfect segue. Your view on fossil fuels. Who is the real enemy, and how do we come all these obstacles that keep getting thrown at the world as we try and move towards net zero?
Yes, I don't even like to use what I call the D word, divestment, because you certainly can't divest away climate change risk from your portfolio. Just because if I were to remove all the fossil fuels from the portfolio at CalSTRS, we're still exposed to that as a long-term risk to our portfolio. So we certainly do believe that engagement is the best route to help these companies transition to a net zero economy. I would say right now, the biggest thing that we struggle with as investors is that there's no architecture to help us manage these risks. And while I totally appreciate what Senator Galvez was saying around, you know, disclosure isn't enough, for us as investors, you know, we have the architecture right now to manage financial risk. There are things that are laid out in terms of US GAAP or IFRS, and what we need is an architecture around climate risk and how companies are exposed to that and how material it is to their business. And so for us, you know, we're working really hard with the regulators, with the International Sustainability Standards Board, with the Securities and Exchange Commission, to really try to get us the information we need as investors to appropriately evaluate and manage the risk of climate change.
The architecture for more or better disclosure, is that what you're suggesting, Aeisha?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Like we have rules when it comes to financial disclosures, but we don't necessarily have the necessary tools and disclosures for climate disclosures.
Very interesting.
Or other environmental, social, and governance risks.
Understood. Senator Galvez, what are your thoughts here? Engagement, who is the real enemy, and how do we combat this enemy?
Nobody likes pointing fingers. And before pointing fingers, let's recognize those ones that have done their job. So the scientists have demonstrated that burning fossil fuels cause greenhouse emissions that warms the planet. And engineers have developed an extraordinary rich portfolio of renewable energy and storage of this energy at all commercial levels. In Canada, unfortunately, this portfolio is not as rich as includes so much variety as Europe, for example. It is much cheaper now to produce a kilowatt hour with photovoltaic, wind, tidal, hydro than fossil fuels. So the problem is that I think we have had in the past this campaign of denying, of doubting the science, and then of delaying the action. And right now, the financial sector is plagued with greenwashing of their products, you know? So it's true that we need to put some order in that. And I understand that the sector may say, we have all the tools and, you know, give us the carrots and we don't need sticks and we will do our best. But as I mentioned before, the time is of essence. we don't have anymore the time that we used to have 20, 30, 50 years ago, and we really need to decarbonize. So we have to guide the financial sector, and but the financial sector, including not only the banks but also the pension plans and the insurance, and that we have to bring the expertise of climate science and energy to the board decisions. And we know that there are some conflicts of interest, and we know that the people in the boards of fossil fuels are in the pension plans, are in the banks. And so therefore, you know, in Canada, for example, if you are not living in the Quebec, the province of Quebec, you make the equation energy equals fossil fuels. Yes. But if you come from Quebec, then it doesn't equate with fossil fuels. It equates with hydropower. So this is historical things that we have to change, and the sector has to address the issue with double materiality. So on one hand, being scared and very much, and with reason, scared of the stranded assets and the investment and the destruction of infrastructure that is costing billions per year. And on the other hand, keep financing the climate crisis. So there is this conundrum that the sector is there, and I think that we need to bring some guidelines from, of course, the government has to lead by example. And so these are some of the points that my bill tried to address.
Interesting. Amy, what is the biggest obstacle, hurdle that we need to overcome here? Is it political? Is it more complete disclosure? Is it an increased belief in the underlying science, or is it something else?
No, I want to pick up on this theme that Aeisha had around data. I would say it is around data, which drives architecture, which drives disclosure. And then, you know, maybe digging in a little bit on that, I would say on the Scope 3 emissions. That is a challenge. That is a challenge, trying to walk that out. And, you know, I think it's easy to sort of have this conversation in the short term to say, okay, do we, you know, how do we reach our targets in the short term? But this is a long-term problem that really needed to be solved yesterday, right? So this is, you know, so I think this sense of we need to figure out through our engagement strategies how to effectively understand the data, how to know what good looks like in transition. If I'm just, you know, in part of my job with the ILN is it's CEO led, and so it's talking to the CEOs and trying to understand, you know, what are the pain points here. It's not convincing them that it's an issue. It's not an issue of climate denying, right? Of saying that this isn't, you know, this isn't material or this isn't of concern. In the CEOs that I work with, the institutional investors I work with, this is a fiduciary responsibility. They are converted. This is a coalition of the willing, but it's the data that needs to drive their actions, and the data is incomplete. And the data is what forms the architecture that Aeisha is speaking about that's going to allow us to really, I think, make this comprehensive change. And, you know, I was just in New York last week for Climate Week, probably like many people there in the audience. And, you know, I was sitting next to a CEO of a major beverage company. And I said, what is your biggest challenge right now? You know, what is your biggest challenge as it relates to climate? And he said, oh, it's not even close. It's Scope 3 emissions. It is really trying to understand the supply chains of my bottlers, of those that are crafting the syrup, of those that are, you know, I mean, it is really a very comprehensive problem. And it is not an easy fix, but the more data and the more convergence we have on our disclosures, I think the faster we're going to get there as an investor community.
Excellent. And it all comes back to data. I mean, how has that been a common theme across all of our panels today? Having accurate and complete data to rely upon and forcing the corporations to give us that data in terms of their disclosure so we can really measure progress and not just talking points, right? I think that's exactly what all of our panelists are hitting on. Amy, I'm going to stay with you. So how can investors, your members of this conference, have a real impact on real decarbonization across the globe? What can they do to have an impact? Is it how they invest their dollars? Is it how, are they being advocates? Are they joining societies? What's the best way for them to have an impact?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think everybody has a role to play. So it's looking at, I often refer to this as like, what are the tools in your toolbox? And, in my role at the ILN, the tool in our toolbox as investors is capital allocation. right? And that is a powerful tool. So when I think about, what can we do? I mean, again, I go back to this idea of engagement, the idea of really working with our portfolio, companies really working with our investments to get a sense of what data they have. We got to work with the data we have right now. We can't just sit back and wait for more data to come in. We got to work with what we have. We need to try to get more data, and we need to try to work with collaborate with other investors, as Aeisha was saying. I mean, really trying to lock arms here to figure out, okay, how can I learn from you? What are you doing? What's working that you're doing that I can learn from? Because this, while we may all have different mandates, we have the same problem here that we're totally on the same team in tackling this issue. And I think there is a sense of solidarity on that on behalf of investors right now, in terms of saying how, and I mean, that's a big part of what we do at Island, is trying to learn from one another, and figure out what are your pain points, what do I have that could help you with that, and then figure out what we can do. But I do, at the end of the day, feel from our perspective, engagement's going to be the name of the game. If we're really if you're looking at real economy decarbonization, you're looking at the whole picture, not just how to meet a short-term target.
Senator Galvez, what do you tell your constituents who ask you, how can I make an impact on real decarbonization?
Well, that constituents see every day what climate change is bringing, the destruction. I'm sure you know about the Fiona and destroying and eroding the coast in the Maritime provinces. I would like to say that when my colleagues here talk about data, we are talking about the same. I say expertise, because data as data is just numbers. So they need to be interpreted, they need to be analyzed, and then there has to be drawn conclusions. And those conclusions are not only coming from the financial sector, but it has to come in the prediction of the scenarios that climate change is bringing, So I know all the regulators are doing a stress test in which they are evaluating the transition risk and the physical risk. But what I want to say is that, and that's also the reason, because the data is not that available, is because this issue with climate change and planet warming, it's very complex, and there are many multi-factors that make that these predictions are not that easy to do, because there are tipping points, and there are they call it the radical uncertainty. Is that the factors are changing themselves as we go. And for example, just take for example an infrastructure. So you have an infrastructure that has extreme weather event, and that infrastructure remains. But does it remain exactly as it was? No, it is now vulnerable because winds and waves and erosion came. So it is not anymore as it used to be, and it's changed, and the changes are dependent on multiple factors. So yes, I agree with the fact that we cannot wait until we know all the information, because as everybody agrees here, we should have started doing these actions before. But so the financial sector, I think that you are right. They know, they understand, and but I think that we have to bring more expertise. So on the energy side, on the climate science, so like they can take better, more well-informed decisions, take away some conflict of interest that there are there, and there are some initiatives that have worked in other places, like for example, green taxonomy in Europe. It went, and there is one, but it didn't work in Canada. The Americans US is with the Securities Exchange Commission, and they are in consultation. So this is a very lengthy process, consultations and feedbacks and this. And so, as I mentioned again, and I will repeat it again, we don't have the luxury of time, so we have to accelerate.
Understood. Aeisha, you're in a very unique position at CalSTRS in that you could direct funds to make an impact, put your money where your morals, beliefs, ethics are to have an impact. What is your view about the best way to really make an impact towards decarbonization across the globe, just from CalSTRS' perspective?
Sure. So I go back to what I said at the beginning in terms of, this has to be a collaborative effort, but we're trying to do our part at CalSTRS, and in particular with our investment portfolio. A huge part of our portfolio is in global equities, where I think there is an opportunity to really lower the emissions of those publicly traded companies. And so we're doing our part in terms of engagement and working with those companies and also trying to get the right disclosure. But climate change affects all industries and it affects all asset classes at CalSTRS. And so we're also using the opportunity to allocate finances to low carbon solutions. And so we're doing this this dual front where we're trying to reduce emissions and at the same time trying to provide capital to those technologies and resources that we think will help make for a better, more efficient and orderly transition to a net zero economy.
Rebecca, with your tobacco-free funds, clearly you're having an impact on decarbonization, but how would you answer that same question if an investor came to you? What can I do to have an impact on this global need and trend?
I think she made a good point, and it's, you kind of take it on both fronts, tackle it on both fronts, but putting your money where where there's long-term growth is also, a way to sort of make a step forward. So if, as an example, if you're excluding tobacco, you've got all of this technology out there that you can invest in, right? And that's part of the complete picture. So I think, again, the data is an issue, and especially if we're going into like smaller cap companies, having a mandated, reporting requirement, having some uniformity with regards to the reporting is important. But I think that, again, there's just so many opportunities right now that, I think from an allocator's perspective, it must be very exciting because there is this moment, we're at this sort of precipice now of sort of the future economy, right? So, yeah.
All right, I'm going to put you all on the spot here. Not totally on the spot because I sent you the questions in advance, but hypothetically on the spot, right? Before we go to audience questions, I just want 1 or 2 sentences from each of you about the current state of ESG investing and your outlook for ESG investing in the years ahead. If you want to answer that under the guise of sustainable impact investing, you are welcome to do so. If you want to keep it under the more narrow lens of just ESG investing, which, as we all, I think, agree now, is a political lightning rod, you can answer under that lens. But just 1 or 2 sentences on the current state and potentially future outlook for ESG investing. And I'm just going to swing back around. Rebecca, you're going to start.
I think it's very exciting. I mean,
perfect.
You have greenwashing to contend with, but there's also just such the community is so robust at this point. I think, yes, we've got to deal with data. Yes, we've got to deal with disclosure, but I think there's so much opportunity. So
exciting and opportunistic. Aeisha.
Well, I'm gonna take the liberty and say, I don't want to talk about the current state. My hope is that several years from now, we're not even differentiating between what's ESG investing and what's not investing. Because, for us at CalSTRS, our liabilities are 50, 100 years into the future. And so we wouldn't be doing, our fiduciary responsibility or upholding our fiduciary responsibility if we weren't managing these long-term risks.
And I'll agree with you and make the argument that in 5 years' time, we won't even have ESG dedicated conferences. Rather, it will just be another underlying factor that all portfolio managers use to select the companies in their portfolios. I agree with you, Aeisha. I'm just adding on to that. Amy, what are your thoughts? Current state of ESG investing, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, no, I want to second that this is an incredibly exciting time. Like, this is an exciting time because of the new technologies that are coming out, the new opportunities. Yes, there are tremendous challenges, and yes, the timeline is short. But I would say that, in my work with investors, I feel like there is a willingness that has never been there to really, really be part of the solution and to think differently. And so that is absolutely critical. And then, with regards to the current state, I mean, I have to second what Aeisha just said about fiduciary responsibility. I mean, contrary to the attacks that have particularly been levied against U.S. asset owners and U.S. Asset managers, I mean, around transition finance, I mean, focusing on real economy decarbonization is a fiduciary responsibility, full stop. It is. It is responsible investing. It is taking into account the risks. You know, I'm thinking of CalSTRS, of your depositors, of, you know, in ILN, we have the Maple 8, you know, many of the Maple 8 there, which are the Canadian pension funds. I mean, it is your fiduciary responsibility to take into account risk. And not taking into account climate risk puts that, you know, doesn't allow you to fully honor that fiduciary responsibility. So I would say that, you know, on behalf of the work we're doing at ILN and on behalf of the members of the ILN, I mean, this is absolutely, this is core business now. This is not a nice to have, this is a need to have, and this is part of how we think about honoring our mandate.
Excellent. And finally, Senator Galvez, your outlook for ESG investing and perhaps how you perceive that space now.
Well, I agree, and I see this also as my dream that eventually in the future everybody is on the boat. I think at this point, standardization is crucial. It is important that ESG concepts are in alignment with climate commitments that have the same meaning across the whole spectrum of the financial sector, with zero room for greenwashing. And that I am so happy. Yes, this is an interesting times. I didn't imagine myself. I've been in this field for 40 plus years, and I am so positive and so encouraged by what I'm hearing from responsible asset owners. So this is fantastic. Thank you.
Excellent. Excellent plug for the name of the conference as well, Responsible Asset Owners.
I'm
right?
loving it.
On cue.
Thank
Do
you
we
very
have
much.
any questions from the audience? We have a few minutes left. Yes, please.
We do, actually. First of all, thank you, Senator Galvez. We like that. If you could say that repeatedly and often, that would be wonderful. We have a message that's come in from the UK from Dave Sumner-Smith, who says, who I think is not a fan of the new government. I might be wrong, but he says, the UK faces major economic problems, mostly self-inflicted. That's probably the clue. One of the first decisions by its new Prime Minister was to cut back on national commitments to net zero. Do you see similar cutbacks elsewhere in the world?
Who would like to take that question?
I think Amy would be good.
I can start.
Please.
I can start. Of course, you know, we are seeing populism rising. And right now I am in Italy, where a party of fascist party has been elected. And yes, it's true, things can happen. And that's why it's so important that everybody plays its role. The government plays its role, and the corporations, private corporations are responsible, and they play their role. So like at the end, democracy is still respected and prosper, and so that we follow what the citizen wants. For example, in Canada, 70% of the population supports climate action and the decarbonization of our economy. So if we have a government that is not doing that, it's going against the will of the population.
Do we have any other questions remote? No? We have a question here in the front. Likely a DWS perspective.
Yeah. Aeisha, also good to meet you at the CII last week. Really, what I'm asking is more or less, what are the proper steps that you're taking to engage with these companies? At DWS, we did a lot of letter writing for many years. Obviously, that's such a light touch. We're now engaging, analysts and portfolio managers are working with our top 200 holdings globally. But it's been mentioned that going straight to the CEO is the most effective way. Can you expound on how each of you really start the proper steps to engagement, to get a seat at the table, to sit down and try to make a difference?
Aeisha, would you like to start?
Sure. I think that for us as shareholders, you know, we have a responsibility to ensure that the right people are inside the boardroom representing our interests. And that's just how governance is structured in the United States. And we really feel like it's the board's responsibility to oversee the CEO and management. And so very often we're trying to engage with members of the board to ensure, one, do we have the right people and the right skill set sitting at the table? And two, are there any risks that we think that they are not addressing appropriately? And so we have conversations with many board members. I will say that our engagement strategy has changed in terms of we try to be very direct about what we're trying to achieve when we engage with companies, whether that be specific governance changes, whether that be particular disclosures around the composition and diversity of their board, or what types of disclosures we're looking for in terms of sustainability or climate change risk. And so that's how we ensure that we're doing our role as a proper steward of the CalSTRS assets, and it helps us measure our success because we have a responsibility to make sure that our stakeholders understand and our beneficiaries understand the resources we're deploying and what's the return we're getting on those resources.
Thank you. We have a question in the back here.
Yes. I would like to ask all three of you about litigation and regulatory risk, because that's become more important with the case load now up at 250 cases worldwide a year, and the plaintiffs winning, and the regulators now coming in very heavily. So I'd like to know how you're dealing with that risk, particularly in the mining sector. And if I can just go on to look at the mining sector, if you look at BHP Billington, who've lost a class action with 200,000 Brazilian families or litigants suing, you look at Glencore with a 6 billion fine, you look at Rio Tinto with the destruction of lots of Australian Aboriginal artifacts, etc. Are you focusing on those issues? And if you are not, why not?
Who would like to jump in and take that one first? Senator Galvez, so the stage is yours.
Yes,
Virtual.
Yes, thank you. Yes, of course, you are absolutely right that the number of litigations, the number of cases that are being solved by the courts, it's increasing exponentially. And that is because there is a lot of room for illegal things, polluting, in all environmental legislation, they all consider the principle of polluter pays. But with all the companies that you have mentioned, one of the issues is that they finished their activities and they left behind a lot of externalities and contamination that needs to be remediated. So again, I come back to the fact that the government has to lead by example. We need a standardization via regulation or via legislation because we cannot put all the pressure on the courts. And if you look into what science is being developed in the climate area is attribution science, because now attribution science is needed in court to cause effect. So for example, 90% of the cases of more than 200 extreme weather events, scientists were, by attribution science, were able to say that planet warming is increasing the power, the destruction impact of these extreme weather events. So we are really late. We need to go faster. And if the sector doesn't go faster, then we need the regulations and we need the legislations to step in to solve these issues.
Thank you, Senator Galvez. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Aeisha. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you all for your questions. A very educational, civil discussion on a very hot and important topic. So thank you. What do we have next?